This week, Jayson Blair and I are concluding our coverage of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders of 1977. In the previous 2 episodes, we covered every aspect of the crime itself and the trial of suspect Gene Leroy Hart. We highly recommend you go over and listen to those first if you're not already very familiar with the case. Today, we're joined by former FBI profiler Julia Cowley of the Consult podcast, and all 3 of us are going to offer our theories. Did the jury get it right? Listen and find out on this episode of Vintage Villains. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Vintage Villains. I'm going to drop you into the episode in a few seconds here, but I wanted to remind everyone that Jayson, Julia, and I recorded this on a YouTube live event for our Patreon subscribers, which allowed everyone there the opportunity to ask questions as well as for us to provide visual aids. I've released these videos onto the Vintage Villains YouTube feed if you want to go and see all that in action. You can find the link for that in the show notes, or you can head over there and search for Vintage Villains podcast. With that, on with the show.
So this is our 3rd episode on the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders. And today we are honored to have Julia Cowley joining us. Julia is a retired FBI agent, former criminal profiler, and the host of the Consult podcast. Julia spent 22 years in the FBI investigating violent crime, white-collar crime, and civil rights. She spent more than a decade as an agent as a member of the famed Behavioral Analysis Unit, or the BAU. Julia makes no bones about the fact that true crime is what led her toward forensic science and law enforcement. Prior to joining the FBI, Julia was a special agent and forensic scientist with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. She's got her bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of Oregon and master's degree in forensic science from George Washington University. At the BAU, Julia did some really cool things, including being the lead profiler on the East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker cases, which you guys may know as the Golden State serial killer case. She worked on the case of serial killer Israel Keys in the early stages of the Long Island serial killer case. She's also had other assignments in the FBI, as I mentioned. You know, you don't get to automatically drop into the BAU. Investigating public corruption, white-collar crime, civil rights in the Boston Division Office of the FBI. And as I mentioned, Julia also has her own podcast, The Consult, on my top list of podcasts that I truly enjoy, in part because The Consult really brings you to cases from a totally different perspective. It gives you an idea, a picture of the type of offender, just like FBI profilers would do, the type of offender that would likely have committed the crime. And one of the other things I love about The Consult that I was telling Julia recently is that they don't just pick the popular cases. They also pick cases that are less heard of. And I think that having their voices come to those cases not only raise public awareness about them, but it really hands, and this is one of the things I picked up on lately, it really hands the law enforcement officers who are working with you guys on those cases and those episodes some great tools to solve some of these lesser heard of cases. And so for those of you guys who are not familiar, and since most of you guys are into true crime, I can't imagine there are many of you, the BAU is a highly competitive part of the already highly competitive agency's investigations and operations section, which is in the critical incident response group. It's been popularized by a lot of television shows like Mindhunter and Criminal Minds, also books and movies like Silence of the Lambs. The BAU is well known also for its study of serial killers, its classification of offenders connected to certain types of crime scenes, and it's been a part of high-profile investigations like the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, the investigation of the killing of John Benet Ramsey, and the murder 2 years ago of four college students at the University of Idaho. So with that, I will turn it over to Allison.
Whoa, that was so great. I love listening to that. So, um, so as a brief recap, because we're now on our third of 3 episodes. In the first episode, we introduced you to the victims. We have 9-year-old Michele Guse, 8-year-old Lori Farmer, and 10-year-old Denise Milner. So we told you about the strange events that happened on the night of the murders, including a man who was apparently stalking the campers and the counselors. We told you about a lot of the evidence that was found at the crime scene, as well as the caves that were discovered and the evidence of a flashlight and semen. We also walked you through the prior crimes of Gene Leroy Hart, who was the prime suspect. A Cherokee and former high school football star, as well as some clues that he may have been in the area that night. We also discussed some of the tensions between some natives and other minorities and whites and law enforcement in this community, as well as a lot of the history around that. In the second episode, we jumped into the manhunt and discussed some of the roles that of Native culture, racial animosity in general, and the broader mistrust of law enforcement that played a role in the case, including this widespread belief that Hart was believed by many, if not most, in the community to have been railroaded. We also discussed the pretrial hearing, as well as Hart's sort of debonair appearance at the trial, where they compared him to a English college professor. The jury, we discussed them and where the prosecution used a lot of their preemptory challenges to strike Native jurors from the trial. We also discussed the DNA testing after the trial in 1989, where results showed that the DNA could have belonged to 1 in 7,700 natives living in the U.S., and later DNA testing conducted that was inconclusive. We also discussed some post-trial events, including felony perjury trials for 2 of the people who suggested a Kansas convict named Bill Stevens, who the defense suggested was the killer. And I recommend you check out those episodes. That is just the beginning of it.
So what Allison and I are going to do, we're going to start with some questions, some of our own questions that we've thought of. But as we talk to Julia, I want you guys to think of your own questions and drop them in the chat at any point. I'll start to collect them, and we will definitely ask Julia about those questions. And Julia, give you a chance to say something. All we've been doing is blabbing.
That's okay. If you just want to start with the questions, I'm good with that. I mean, this is a very interesting case. And as you know, those that listen to the consult know, I'm familiar with Oklahoma and the crimes in Oklahoma. And when I worked on Walika, I remember hearing about this case. And I think one investigator had said that the Walika murders were like as big as the Girl Scout murders had been back in 1977. So I'm familiar, and it's Walika's not that far from Locust Grove.
No.
It's not like right next to each other, but they're sort of close to one another, maybe a couple hours away. So so I've heard about this case, and I did not work on it, but I heard about it when I was working Walika, and I'd heard about it prior to that as well.
Yeah, it is truly a fascinating case, and interesting, a lot like the Walika murders. I felt like in learning on the consult about that case, and I've probably asked you like, I don't know, 30 questions about that case. There were just a lot of, in listening to those episodes, which I would recommend anybody go back to listen to. There were a lot of things that I think for me are counterintuitive naturally, that are really the realities of crime. And it was interesting to hear that, which sort of flows into my first question. So, we've got a crime scene where 3 girls are attacked in a tent in the middle of the night. Clearly, 2 of them were hit with some kind of blunt or sharp object inside the tent. There was a semen stain on the pillowcase that was in the tent, but then there were semen stains after the girls' bodies were moved 150 yards past the counselor's tent across the street into a tree that were also found on their bodies. And I was just curious, from your perspective, what the crime scene tells you. And my next question is what does the victimology tell you? But what does the crime scene tell you as somebody looking at the case, Julie?
So, looking at this case, what I see initially is what I would call like a blitz attack. They're attacked, they're incapacitated quickly, and very likely sexually assaulted at some point in the tent. Don't know for sure, but that all could have happened in the tent. We just don't know that. We know that there's evidence of a sexual assault or multiple sexual assaults. But then what I see is perhaps an attempt to clean up, which, you have all the sheets taken, the blood, attempts to wipe up the blood that's on the floor of the tent. This isn't a tent that's on the ground. This is, I think, on wood planks of some sort is what it appeared in the crime scene photos. And to stuff all the evidence into these sleeping bags and take it out, and which I find sort of an absurd thought. There's no way you're going to hide. First of all, 3 girls are not where they're supposed to be, and there is no way you're going to clean up a crime scene like that and dispose of all evidence. But sometimes when I see this attempt to clean something up, I think about this person may be evidence conscious. They may have a criminal history. They may have a little bit of knowledge about evidence and trying to obliterate it of some sort. But ultimately, it's not successful.
Yeah.
The crime was discovered almost immediately upon a counselor waking up. It wasn't like it was really that well hidden, but it was an attempt to, I think, try to clean up the crime scene and hide what was done to maybe prevent discovery, delay discovery of some sort. Or
to make it harder from like a time perspective, make it maybe harder for them to find the girls, figure out what's going on. Because I found
confuse the issue, kind of. You're confusing the crime scene. And not only that, you were destroying forensic evidence by doing that as well. And of course, in 1977, we're not thinking about DNA at the time. I'm sure offenders and criminally savvy people knew, well, they can type my blood. They could determine different types of body fluids left, but there was just not the precision that we can today to match biological evidence to a person with the certainty that we can today. So that's not necessarily a thought, but the thought is, I'm going to clean this up. I'm going to hide it. I'm going to delay it. And to me, that says, okay, this is somebody who has some level of understanding of crime scene and crime scene processing. And I would be saying I could be considering somebody who has been in trouble before with the law. 100%, can't say that 100%. And I'm always very cautious with profiling. None of it is 100%. It never is. But this would be a consideration. So that's what I see when I initially looked at it.
Yeah, it seemed to me too like he wanted to have Denise, who was the eldest of the girls, separate. Like the other 2 girls were in the sleeping bag, and maybe Denise could have walked out on her own volition with him, or he could, had her with him, and then the other 2 girls kind of slung over is the only way I can maybe visualize it. But it just seems like did it seem to you like a guy that didn't have really a plan before he went in there? Was it just a crime of opportunity? Did it look like an opportunistic kind of a thing? I mean, given that it happened the night that the girls arrived at the camp, there wasn't much time to plan, but it was like, I just wonder.
I think there was a plan. I do.
Yeah.
But he may not have known exactly prior that what he was going to encounter. I mean, there is some evidence that there was looking in other tents and determining, okay, who's here, who's there. And so he may have picked this one not only because of the distance from the counselors and from the other tents, but possibly because there are only 3 people in there. And that made it a little bit more manageable. But I think there was a plan. And he had a plan to go in there, and he executed it, and it was fairly efficient. I mean, I think he incapacitated them fairly quickly, which is what he intended to do. And then he was able to carry out what his plan was. So I think that there is a kind of a combination of somebody who had a plan, but also had to deal with thinking on his feet at the time, because he didn't know for sure what he was going to encounter. But at some point he realized, okay, I've got 3 here. This is what I'm going to go in and do. And I see what you're saying, Allison, too. It does seem that Denise was the main focus. And it's very likely that the other 2 were just, I don't want to say obstacles, but could have been just, okay, they're here, I have to deal with them. Witness elimination. But not only that, as an opportunist, the offender takes advantage of them as well and sexually assaults them. But I do think his main interest and his main focus and his main, we talk about victim selection, desirability, she was probably the one that fit the criteria the best for him at that time.
Yeah. And that makes me think of something else. The different events that happened at the night or in the night, like the counselor seeing the dim light in the woods, putting her flashlight on it, and then the light going off and that happening repeatedly, the low guttural scream that was happening behind the girls' camp. And as the counselors walked to it, it stopped. And then there was that girl that was grabbed by her raincoat. That was another example. And I wonder, it made me think, like, one, is this offender just trying to taunt everyone? Because if you truly were trying to sneak around 100% surreptitiously, you probably would have kept a little bit lower of a profile. So I wonder about that. But also the girl with the raincoat, I wonder about, because while there were 3 girls killed, it makes me wonder, when he tried to grab her earlier, assuming he is the offender, was he really looking for just one target? And everything else was an obstacle to that. And whether he was spending that night sort of scoping out what is the most isolated place, what's the best place to do this, and had some false starts along the way.
I think that's very possible. I think he had a plan to go in and attack somebody, and took advantage of the best opportunity after looking around. I think you bring up the low guttural sounds that were reported. And that's really interesting, because that's counterintuitive to somebody trying to be sneaky. And that would be something I would be thinking, is that something he cannot help? Yeah. Why would he do that if he's really going in, which I believe he was really going in to grab someone, to sexually assault them and murder them? Then why would he draw attention to himself like that? So I wonder, I would start thinking, is that some sort of habit that he cannot control? So,
but also the other twist to that is that scene where the counselor sees the dim flashlight in the woods. She takes her flashlight and she points it toward it. Then the light goes off. But while she's still looking, when she takes her flashlight away, it goes back on. And then she points her light on it. It goes back on again. It goes back off again. Same thing happens again. And then she books it. And I just think to myself, after she shines the light on you the first time, and then you turn the light off, if you were truly trying to hide completely, you would just keep it off until she disappears. So why turn it back on, turn it back? You know what I mean? Are you trying to taunt these people? Is sort of what I was thinking.
Well, when you look at ultimately what he did, it's a sadistic crime. And as we've talked about before on our show, it doesn't just end with the crime itself. It doesn't just start and end with the crime itself. This is a part of an offender's personality. And if he can taunt people beforehand and scare them, there's a lot of joy of doing that. And it's almost like, even though this isn't a home, he's invading space and he's scaring people. And there's there is a lot of gratification and satisfaction that comes from that for somebody who enjoys hurting others. And so, yes, I think that could very possibly be just a way to really make the most out of what he's doing. Just as like sometimes after the crimes, you see offenders communicate with victims or victims' families, prolonging their pain and suffering. They get a lot of enjoyment out of it. That could very well be what those actions were all about.
So that if it's a sexually motivated sadistic crime or sadistic crime, it may actually, the act that the person is getting gratification, the part we focus on is the murder, but it may have actually begun long before.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, these types of crimes are fantasy based, and there's probably so much that just goes into this. And then here he has this opportunity to sneak around all night and scare people and look at them and invade their space and move in their space. And that takes a certain personality, a certain type of person that's willing to do that. And, if you think about like, I mean, how would it feel to just go into someone's house and they're there and you're sneaking around their house? I mean, that, to us, that would be something we would never consider doing. It would be frightening. It would be something
be weird, right?
Yes, it would just be weird. But they're, these types of people, they enjoy that, and they enjoy, going through people's belongings and looking at them. And so people say, well, why did they steal that? That has no value. It's not about financial value to them.
No.
It's about, it's about control. It's about
D'Angelo. That's a great example. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so I also think, and Jessica brought this up in the chat, was a really good point. And as far as sort of, because as we're trying to suss out, was it a particular girl or set of girls, or was it victim motivated, or was it location motivated? Jessica brings up like the tent in this case was the most isolated of the tents and the most isolated wing of the camp. And I have a hard time finding that being like any, coincidental. It's almost like this is the one that he could go in. And also the tent the only tent that had 3 girls in it rather than 4. So I do wonder,
Allison, I slightly disagree. I do not think it was the most isolated unit of the tent.
It was very isolated, though.
I think it was the one closest to the caves and where egress.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, again, though, that still points to location.
It was like the place that you would pick. Yeah, but it's not necessarily the most.
There's definitely some practical considerations of choosing that tent. I think that has to be considered, whether it's because it had only 3 people in it, or because it, like as Jayson said, it's closest to where the offender needed to escape to. It's furthest from the counselor. There's could be a number of practical reasons for choosing that. I think when we look at talk about the victimology, there's kind of a collective victimology here. They all sort of fit the same, although you might have a range of ages. You really don't just have, was one of them specifically targeted. I think it was a lot about the location, and that came first in this particular case.
So the fact that it's a camp in a Girl Scouts camp as opposed to something else would be something that would be, you kind of look like you said it's sort of a collective victim.
It's in terms of looking at victimology, and when we have serial cases, or we look at certain, you are trying to see, was there something very specific about this victim that was why they were chosen, and looking at all of their victimology, I'm not sure that it's practical to try to just assess each and every one of their lives and why were these 3 victims selected that night, because it would be important to know, well, did any of them have any stalkers? We'd want to know that. Were there any problems leading up prior to coming to camp that somebody would come out here and follow them and do something like this? Probably not, but that would be something we would want to know. And I think when you look at them, they all have really probably similar victimologies. Particularly, they're all at this camp. It's all their first night there. Some of them have never been to this camp before. It's very dark. It's very confusing. You wake up in the middle of the night and you're not in your own bed, especially at that age. You probably don't even know where you are at first. It takes you a while to adjust. So these are the things that I think make them vulnerable. All of them.
So particularly
all of the campers there, and some more vulnerable than others. It is kind of interesting too that the three of them had not been to this camp before, I believe.
Right.
Correct.
So that
especially Denise and Lori, especially. Yeah, I wasn't sure about Michele.
And it's hard to know if he would have known that or not. I don't know if that would be information that this offender would have been privy to, but that increases their risk a little bit just because they're unfamiliar with it. It's not something that an offender would necessarily know, but it makes it easier to attack them when they may not know where to go. They may wake up and have no idea where they are and be confused, and it's dark. I mean, I read that it just got pitch black there. You couldn't see anything. So that makes it pretty easy to just go in there and they would have no clue. Even if they heard something, even if they woke up and that's somebody in here, they would be very confused right away. This would not register with any of them immediately that they were in immediate danger.
One of the things I was also wondering about, I don't know if you saw this in the notes, but there was a note that Michele Hoffman, who's one of the counselors who rode over on the bus with them, that several months before she had found a note that essentially said, this isn't word for word, but that 4 girls are going to be murdered at the camp. And I wonder whether, it may be connected to it. It may not be connected. The note was thrown out, but just sort of assuming that that is actually from the offender. Would that tell you anything about the planning or the likely location that the person are there any clues about how close this person would have been? Because I might imagine you'd have to be somewhat familiar with the camp already before that.
Yes. Yeah, you'd have to be very familiar with the camp, I would think. And you would have to, this goes back to fantasy. If this truly was in fact written by the offender, this plan and idea was in his head months before. So this isn't somebody that just came upon the camp that night. This is somebody who's been around, who got close enough to be able to leave a note. Was it in a box of donuts or something? I don't know if that's accurate. I think
that's what they say on.
I think I saw that in a transcript or something. I saw it somewhere. But you have to be pretty close to be able to do something like that and be familiar with the area, with the camp, with its schedule as well.
Right.
Who's going to
be
there?
I had been curious. That was one of my earlier questions when we were first going over this case was, it was clear somebody had been stalking the area and before the girls arrived. There were counselors there and everything as we were discussing the note. There were some flap cut off one of the tents. There were some other knife marks in the tent fabrics. So they knew somebody was around there, but I don't know if there was any way of knowing that there was a Girl Scout camp imminent, that it was on its way. I don't know if this was a publicly announced thing. So that was
no. There were ads in the newspaper, in the prior newspaper, the Tulsa World.
And we know there were newspapers around. I mean, there were newspapers in the cave. Newspaper was,
Another thing I was thinking based on what you're saying about all those prior things happening and what Julie is saying about the sadism to it, afterwards in the cave, there's that note that says 7767. What was it?
Yeah, the improperly written date.
Yeah. Well, I say properly, but
it was
in continental Europe, it is. So 1977, 6/17, the killer was here.
Bye fools.
Bye fools. Yeah, thank you. That seems like more taunting, and because I was thinking about like somebody like the Long Island serial killer, who is believed to have called the victims' families at this time, you don't have a cell phone to steal or something like that to call them, but there are all these things you can do to taunt people. You can sort of presume they're eventually going to find the caves. And I just wonder,
Ooh,
that's
a good question. I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
That's a great question.
Well, I'm just sort of wondering about the post-offense behavior and the taunting, because I think for some of these people, and I'll go back to the Israel Keys interview, the sadism never ends. It never ends. Like, once Israel Keys was done with the sadism with his victims, he was applying that same sadism to the poor law enforcement investigators who were trying to come. So I'm just curious whether that tells you anything.
Yeah. I mean, it is, like you said, taunting. And what I want to say is that not all serial killers or offenders like this one or Long Island serial killer do that. They're not, there are some high profile cases where we have seen that, where offenders communicate, as I said, with victims.
Yeah.
Right. Communicate with the public in some way. So that's not unheard of, or communicate with law enforcement and taunt law enforcement. So this would just be another way of doing that. I think, knowing you'd have to know the area to know somebody is going to come across this someday. So
and the risk associated with it. Like, there's a couple things in here that happen that I view as really risky. Like, if the assault starts in the tent, that's a great place for the assault to end. And like you said, it may have been an attempt at cover up, but like, I would think a lot of offenders committing crimes, like, you commit a crime, and the first thing you're thinking about is, how do I skedaddle out of here as fast as humanly possible? Not, how do I move 3 bodies in sleeping bags with evidence 150 yards, or somewhere between 100 and 150 yards. And then I think about something like leaving those notes in the caves or other things like that. All you're doing is, like, in my mind, increasing the likelihood that you're going to get caught, which makes me think that you have to have something driving you, something powerful driving you to do this. Like, And I had asked you before, and I know you're going to bat this one down, but I had asked you whether maybe putting them in the sleeping bags and carrying them 150 yards away from the bloody tent could have been undoing, in the sense that, sometimes when murders happen and the offender may know or have a relationship or feel bad or guilt or remorse, they might throw a blanket over the body and cover it, or other things like that. Then on the other hand, so many things about this crime seem so brutal and sadistic, but I was curious, any chance of undoing there being involved?
Oh, I think I mentioned this to you earlier. I don't really like the concept undoing. I know that's come up recently in another case. It's an iffy concept. And I wouldn't necessarily think or jump to the idea that because he's put 2 girls in their bodies in a sleeping bag and dumped them in the woods, I wouldn't jump to that as undoing. Undoing is a result of, like, guilt and remorse. And when you see undoing, and I will tell you, I have not personally worked on a case where I saw undoing. I've seen presentations from colleagues that have worked on cases, and they usually involve parents. And what you see is that care is taken with the victim of some sort. I don't see any care here. So I don't really see this undoing. What I would tend to see, and as I had described earlier, whether you're moving things around or you're covering them with brush or trying to hide them, I see more of a practical consideration versus this psychological thing of undoing. I feel guilt and remorse. I'm trying to erase what I've done, because I just don't see that element of caring, which is sometimes how undoing will present itself. Like I said, that is a very iffy kind of concept to me. And it's not impossible for an offender who does these horrible things to maybe feel, bad about themselves for doing this. I do, like, for example, I think there are offenders that, don't want to telegraph what they've done. They're just very different, and maybe don't want to highlight what they've done the way other offenders who seem to relish in the notoriety and the taunting. But that's not what I see here. I don't see undoing. I see some practical considerations of just trying to hide things and move things around and confuse the issue and delay discovery.
Yeah.
And
Maybe
obliterate
even create more,
evidence.
also get the added bonus of maybe creating a little bit more panic, right, among the people. But one of the things that I found weird about the moving them and dropping the bodies is how much he left. He left the flashlight. He took the murder weapon, probably. Left the flashlight, left the glasses, one pair of glasses that have been stolen. So, but I guess to be a serial killer does not mean you need to be meticulous or to be a killer.
No.
Yeah.
No, that could be he dropped it and in the dark he couldn't find it. He was looking for it. Perhaps something scared him.
He aspired to the
interrupted
level of an
him.
organized killer, but just couldn't quite get there.
I mean, he's somewhat organized. I mean,
Yeah,
I don't see
yeah.
anything here that tells me he doesn't have clear thought process. And
Yeah.
so there's some organization to it, but even the best laid plans can be interrupted. What you're dealing with is human element here. And you're out in nature too. And so he could have been surprised or interrupted in some way and left the area. Maybe he dropped things and couldn't find it in the darkness, or there's just could be a number of reasons why he just abandoned what maybe his original plan was or his ideal plan, and that was abandoned. I mean, we see it all the time and we can't explain things in a scene because somebody has a plan going in, and even the most organized plan and the most calm, cool, collected offender can make mistakes. And, depending on how perhaps a victim responds, I mean, there could be all sorts of things that go wrong for them.
I've seen this come up in the chat a few minutes ago, and it is one of the questions on the list, and I'm curious about it as well in terms of the statistics and everything involved. Given the racial elements of this case, we have a Native suspect, we have one African American girl and two white girls. Is it fair to assume that a person of one race would just indiscriminately cross race victims this way? I mean, have you seen much of that, or do killers tend to stick within their own racial demographic? Or
yes, they do. Victims tend to choose their victims within the same demographics, or just location. They're close or they're available to them, and that tends to be victims that are similar to them. But I would never rule out somebody because the race wasn't the same. And in this case, I don't think that played a part in it at all. You had obviously a diverse group here, and I don't think that was a consideration for this offender. So I wouldn't say because the offender and the person arrested and tried for this was Native, couldn't have done it because these victims weren't also Native. Right. I would not make that assumption at all. But yeah, statistically, if you have a victim of one race, they're usually killed by somebody of the same race statistically. But again, I would never rule that out. I mean, in all of our reports, we always say the offender is most likely a white male, but you can't say that with certainty. Even in, there's a famous case, I think it was out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and this was before my time, but it was a white victim, white neighborhood, and the profile was a white male, and the killer turned out to be a black male. And the reason why is because this was a white neighborhood, and a black man would have stood out, but in this case, that just wasn't the case. And so, you can't just always make those assumptions. We do our best. It's based on probabilities. But I would not rule out anybody based on their race.
One of the things I was wondering about that, you're fine. You're always fine. One of the things I was wondering about, Larry Day, who was an inmate who escaped with Gene Leroy Hart, testified at the pretrial hearing and at the trial. Hart's previous crimes that he was at least arrested for involved breaking into a female police officer's apartment. It was a first-degree burglary, and then 3 other families. So it was done at night. It was while the dwelling was occupied. And then he was accused of, not convicted for all of this, but kidnapping of sexual assault of 2 19-year-old women. None of that involves crimes against children, but Larry Day, who was
Larry Dry.
Right, thank you. Larry Dry, who escaped with him, said that Hart had told him on 2 occasions in an area not too far from this one that he wanted to sexually assault girls that were 13 or under. And I'm wondering what you would, and it just gets me thinking about, because I think my natural tendency is to think that, and I know everybody's got to start somewhere. So, but my natural tendency is to think, if I see a potentially sexually motivated murder, that this person has got some other history, I mean, with young children. And so I'm just wondering, what would you normally expect to see when you think about this murder in terms of prior crimes or prior acts, even if they're not?
I mean, looking at this case, I would expect to have seen perhaps some other victimization of children, just because, but it doesn't have to always be the case. I mean, this, it could be very well, when we talk about victim selection and desirability, availability, and vulnerability, I mean, every offender has their ideal victim, picture perfect ideal victim. Usually that's the first thing that goes out the window. The offenders, they're hunting. They're looking for their ideal victim. So, they're not always going to find that ideal victim. So then, what's available to me, and then who's the most vulnerable. So that is the process they kind of go through, and whoever's the most vulnerable, that is who ends up being the victim. And that's the selection process that an offender will go through. So I wouldn't necessarily, I would say, yes, in this case, I would expect to have seen at some point some sort of victimization.
There was an accusation, to be fair. It was mentioned in the book about the case from a prior girlfriend, and she had a toddler son, and he had evidence of possible sexual assault. Yeah. So, but that's the only thing that we found.
And I don't.
I'm bringing it up because somebody might.
Yeah, but I don't think I don't think you can put much weight on the ex-girlfriend saying that a child who can't speak, that there was evidence of, and I mean, to me,
the doctor that saw him, that saw the damage.
Yeah.
So,
but,
I mean,
John Benet Ramsey, that's an excellent example, right? Like, supposedly John Bonet, at least according to many very interesting people on Twitter, there was evidence of her being abused. I don't know. I just don't put much weight into that kind of stuff. And I don't know that it's that important, because I think of people like BTK, to her point, and also to Julia's point, and also Israel Keys. Like, maybe you do have this. I never thought the idea that vulnerability, desirability, and availability happened in a certain order of operations. But if desirability starts, and like you said, it's the first thing that goes out the window, I can't put much weight on what the victim is like unless there are a ton of victims that are just like that, right? And
then desirability is different for everybody, and some may have a very specific type of victim, and there are other people that have a very wide range of who they will victimize. And just because
they're vulnerable,
yes, it could be that. It could be a wide age range. It could be different. It doesn't, just because they've offended against females doesn't mean they're not going to offend against male. You see that. It could just be their range of what's desirable is just much bigger than others as well. So, but if we're going back to probabilities, in a case like this, you would think that there was past victimization of children, possibly past victimization and escalation of sexual or violence and of sexual violence against victims, whether they're underage or of age. Certainly voyeurism and burglary. I mean, that's where it all starts. And especially in somebody like this, who we've already seen is going into occupied dwellings, whether it's a tent where it's temporary or not, this is where it starts. This is what you're going to see early on. So I always tell if you have somebody, and I can't stress this enough, if you have somebody who is going into a dwelling that they know is occupied, and that you have a problem. Mm-hmm. So that is a problem. That is a person that needs to be, remembered and monitored, because in future crimes, that's when you see the escalation to actual hands-on offenses of people. Now, when you have these burglars that go in during the day and they're trying to avoid people, and they go to the houses where there's not a car in the driveway, and those are the ones that are in that for a financial motive. But when somebody is going in at after hours, when people are expected to be home and they know that they're home, they see cars in the driveway, then you have to consider that there is another motive there, and that motive is very dangerous. And that's who we're dealing with here. Even though these are temporary dwellings, they're still dwellings that have people in them.
And Allison, you want to? Oh, sorry.
Oh, by the same respect, if we're doing sort of the inverse here, where you have him going into occupied dwellings, do you think his two escapes from custody, from prison or jail, could that be a similar part of the picture? Here's somebody who walks into wherever he wants, and here's a guy who will escape from any cage you put him in. Is there a similar kind of mindset there of just kind of like, I don't care what anybody wants in terms of boundaries. I'm going to do or go where I want.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly, it's a good way to describe him. He doesn't have any boundaries. He doesn't have any concept of, I have to obey the rules. It's not there. Even take these crimes away from him, the murders of the Girl Scouts at the camp. Just take those away and look at what he's already done. And that's pretty bad. That is a person with absolutely no boundaries at all, and extremely violent, extremely dangerous, and extremely controlling, manipulative. It's all there. And so, however this investigation was conducted and whatever the perception is and what it was at the time of how it was done, he absolutely should have been thought of as, number one suspect. This is a person local to the area. And I think, in terms of this camp, if you're in that area, you likely know the schedule when all these people are coming in from out of town and are going to be at camp. This is something that happened every year. They were there for 2 weeks at a time, and girls rotated in and out of there all the time. So the locals would have a pretty good idea that was going on, at what time it started during the year, when it ended. And so I think this was somebody very familiar. And so when you have a crime this horrific, your first thought is going to be of the guy who kidnapped 2 19-year-old pregnant women and brutally assaulted them. And why wouldn't you think of him as the number one suspect? So I think he was absolutely properly prioritized, whatever people may think about the subsequent investigation and allegations of corruption and planting evidence. He absolutely was properly prioritized as a number one suspect in this crime. I would have, everything that his prior history indicated and was proven, but is it absolutely this guy fits? He's got to be your number one suspect.
So one of the things I'm curious about was something the locals said, and this is what I was going to ask you about, Allison. But there was a military style, because we had talked about it. There was a military style footprint found in blood, and then there was also a tennis shoe print. And I think that led people, although I think it's more complicated, that led some people to think maybe there were two offenders, possibly even a female, like a counselor, involved. Although I will say I see this often because I think sometimes people just simply can't imagine that two people or three people could be killed just by one offender. But does the second tennis shoe print, or is there anything about the scene that screams two offenders to you?
Oh, me?
Yeah, or a group of Odinists.
That's actually a question I was very curious about myself, because that is definitely a common point of contention with it when you have those multiple victim crimes like this, that is the likelihood of being one or two or more involved.
Yeah, and I think this is where Jayson, when he had said earlier, sometimes some of the stuff he's heard on our show is counterintuitive. And so many cases that when you have multiple victims, most people or many people tend to think, well, there has to be multiple offenders, because there's no way one person could control all of these victims. And when you look again back at statistically, when you have multiple victims, overwhelmingly you have a single offender. And so in terms of profiling a case, unless we have, now in this case, there are two sets of footprints, but I don't consider that overwhelming evidence to me that I would say, yes, there's two offenders there. That crime scene was not properly secured at first, and you had a lot of girls and kids and people running around, and you don't know if somebody went in there and didn't admit to it. It's just, It's very hard to say. So I would not necessarily say that that was directly part of the crime as opposed to contamination after the fact. So I don't see anything in this crime that would lead me to believe that multiple offenders had to be involved. This is something somebody could have done on their own. It was very easy to go in there, hit three little girls while they're sleeping, and then, take them out, even one by one, maybe a couple at a time. I don't know. But one person could accomplish what was accomplished there. And not only that, look at his previous crime. Again, even if you just say he didn't do this, but we've already seen that at least that offender kidnapped two women at gunpoint. I think it was at gunpoint. But anyway, he kidnapped two women coming out of the bar and was able to control them. And it was just him. There was nobody else involved. We've seen so many different crimes where multiple victims are involved and there is one offender. Happens all the time. It happens most of the time. And so again, I don't see anything that would lead me to believe that there was anyone else involved, let alone a female.
Yeah.
And I just don't see it.
I kind of imagine in my head when you describe that, like the two offenders, I almost think about like sniper, if you have sniper shots coming from this direction, but they come from two different guns, that could still be one offender. But if you have shots coming from this direction and this direction and this direction, then you really want to look at multiple offenders. So you're sort of thinking, is there anything in this scene that couldn't have been done by just one person?
Right. Something that had to have happened simultaneously, or, we just did a case, and, the victimology told us that the offender always had to have a woman meet with him when he was conducting a drugs transaction, and he was killed.
Was that Bo? Which case was that? I'd love
Bo
people
Bedford.
to know that.
Yeah, Bo Bedford, Shelby County, Alabama. He was killed. This is a cold case from 2001, and we just assisted the Shelby County, Alabama Sheriff's Department on it. And so Bo, while he was a handyman, he also supplemented his income dealing crack cocaine, and he had a system of meeting people, and he always wanted to have a female present. He often took advantage of the females and extorted them, and would trade drugs for sex. And anyway, lots going on there. But because of his victimology and because of, some of the risks in his life, we thought there was very possibly more than one person involved based on the crime scene and based on his normal pattern. And we thought you have to consider there's probably two people involved. And that's rare. It's rare that we side on multiple offenders. And in this case, I do not see a case of multiple offenders involved in this. There is nothing compelling enough. Now, if you had, two different people's DNA, then I would be like, okay, maybe. But one, healthy, fit, strong person who has committed similar types of crimes in the past could very easily control these three girls who, again, he had the cover of darkness that he used to his advantage. He had the fact that this was their first night there. There was confusion for them. And he also had the element of surprise. And they may not have even, woken up at all. And
choice of weapon, axe in the middle of the night. Because at first I thought to myself, a gun would be a great way to control three people.
So what made you think an axe? Is there some evidence? I didn't.
There was some reference to an axe, but it was kind of flimsy. I think it was like a hatchet type.
And I think we don't have the medical examiner's report, but in the testimony, they talk about the possibility of an axe, but nothing definitive, like a small hatchet. And I thought to myself, like, a gun would be a great weapon, except for the problem with threatening someone with a gun is you often have to talk. So
he'd have to talk, and they'd have to be able to see
it. It was so dark. I think
it was dark, and he had his flashlight, but it was, he had muted it because he had covered it with the black
plastic
trash, trash bag or something like that. And so, honestly, the easiest and most practical way to go in there and get control is just to go in and hit them while they were sleeping. And that's quiet. It doesn't draw attention, and it will quickly incapacitate them. Or stun them at the very least. Maybe they weren't killed immediately, but stunned enough where they're not going to even be able to fight back. So I think that's possibly what happened to JonBenét. I think she was probably, in bed, and she was hit over the head with something. And, I know there's a debate about whether a stun gun was used or not. She has those, 2 sets of marks on her. I'm not a stun gun expert, so I can't, really weigh in on that. I find the marks to be very interesting and unusual, but I think that's very possible. What happened, she was hit on the head, and that would be, knock her out and incapacitate her and stun her, and she would just be able to be picked up and carried to where she was eventually found.
And then moved for the sort of sexual part of it for the criminal, whatever that was.
Right.
I was one of the things that I think was certainly baffling for a lot of people in the town. So they had this soft-spoken high school football star, who was accused of these brutal, sort of horrendous crimes. And he shows up in trial in a really nice suit. He has a press conference before where he's soft-spoken, seems relatively humble about things, but I told Allison today I don't trust anything anyone says once their lawyers are involved. But, because they're managing perception. But he didn't seem to fit the profile of what I would imagine in thinking about sort of like a sadistic, sociopathic killer. And then I was sitting at my desk reading Personality Disorders in Modern Life, because that's what I do for fun.
As one does, yeah.
Yes, right. And I didn't even get to the section on this, but I remembered that with personality disorders, often, those disruptive behaviors are happening when people are under stress or they're not paying attention to their behaviors. But when they are self-monitoring really well, like thinking about your average person with antisocial personality disorder who's somewhat socially skilled, what comes off as being charming and interesting sometimes. And so that maybe being a sort of sociopathic behavior and sadistic behavior isn't that far off from a really charming or interesting person a la Ted Bundy when you are self-monitoring. And so I'm wondering whether that's something maybe we should give less weight to the way that people present.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
In fact, no, I actually, no, I think you should give a lot of weight.
Okay.
I think you need to really question when somebody comes across as very charming and very charismatic. And I just don't think you should take them at face value. I think you really do have to sit there and question, because
I say that about myself all the time.
Without giving anything away, I recently talked with somebody, and they're accused and convicted of a horrible crime, and talking with them, they are very nice to talk to. And I thought to myself, do not get fooled. You can like people who do horrible things. They can come across as very nice. That's how they get away with a lot of things. That's how they can fool and manipulate and take advantage and gain access to people through their personality. And I'm not an expert in psychopathy. I can't diagnose people, but psychopathy and narcissism, I mean, characteristics of that are, charming and charismatic. And a lot of times you see that in the business world. So
yeah.
They can take advantage. They can get people close and you like them. And, and then they can turn on you as well, obviously. So yeah, you have to be cautious when somebody, wow, they seem like they're a really nice person. You really just have to always be asking yourself, am I being fooled? I've interviewed enough people to know that somebody can do something really bad. They can take advantage of people, but you can actually sit and have a pretty good conversation with them and come out of there and think, well, no wonder they committed all those crimes. They're pretty, I like them. I mean, really, you have to.
Too. Yeah.
Yes.
No.
Always question that when somebody is too smooth, when somebody is too, when you come out of this, and then I know this is just a terrible way to live. And I think I've told this story before, and Jayson probably has heard this, but I used to work very closely with the Boston police. And one of the detectives I worked with said I was the happiest cynical person he'd ever met. I just go around, but I'm like super cynical. Like, that person was just too nice. I don't know about that,
I don't know about that.
And, I don't go through life questioning everybody that's nice to me. But when I'm in a situation where they're accused of something and they come across really nice, I think you have to take that into consideration. Is this how they committed their crime? And this is how they're fooling people because they're so charismatic. They come across so well. And we just can't let people like that fool us.
You just made me realize something. So I've been since 2007, part of my job has been working with clients in mental health settings. And my absolute favorite clients were either had already been diagnosed or were later diagnosed with either antisocial personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, or borderline personality disorder. Vast majority of them were messes. Vast majority of did bad things, but they were absolutely the most enjoyable people to talk to. 100% most enjoyable. And you had to remind yourself when you were talking with them, don't fall for it. Like everyone else does. Don't fall for it. So that really resonated with me. Sorry, Allison.
One thing that really stuck out with me too, in terms of the way Gene presented himself, he comes off as very socially aware, very articulate, very intelligent guy. Has a way of sort of, when he talks about he's not a hero and he says these things. And another thing that he does though, is he admits to part of a crime that he's accused of. He'll say something like, oh, I only raped one of the girls, not both of them. And I didn't kidnap them. Or with the home invasion, I think he tried to minimize that a little bit. Do you think there's something in the psychology there of if he is a guilty person, but he's only going to admit to part of it? Does that indicate anything about this person's, I don't know, mind in some way?
It indicates he has a really smart defense attorney.
Yeah, I just, I found that really interesting. I'm only going to admit to part of this, but not the whole thing.
I think most killers, like that, or this particular one in this case, they're never going to tell you everything.
Right.
And we like to think, even the best interviewers and the best profilers, and I can get this information out of this person. And no, you never will. And they're just never going to tell you every single thing. And they're always going to hold something back, that they keep for themselves. And then also too, somebody who's extremely good around people and manipulating people, if they take accountability, or they admit to some part of it, and like, oh, okay, well, they admitted to that, why won't they admit to that? Then you believe them. He's like, well, they're admitting to something, so they become more believable. Well, they know that. And you may have evidence. Yes.
You're going to laugh. My mom said when I was a kid, she was like, you would never deny, like your brother would deny taking the snacks from the cabinet. You would never deny it. You admit to like 1/10 of it to try and convince us that you had admitted to everything. And then we would find out all this other things. So I'm like, yeah, it's a great strategy.
It is a great strategy. And it's people have a hard, why did he admit to this, but he won't admit to that? And we question that. It's just, well, they could be playing a game. It could be, well, they'll have to believe me if I admit to part of it. And because we do, if somebody tells us partial truths, then we tend to believe the other stuff that they're saying. But that could just be some, game they're playing with us and getting some enjoyment. But like, I fooled them on that one. But what I've come to realize, and my colleague, Bob, has really reiterated this to me over the years, and he's on our show, and was a mentor to me at the BAU. And he's like, so many times, like, these killers that we talk to, and they, you interview them and they tell you things, they really have so very little insight into their own behavior, and they rarely tell you the entire truth. And they just play games. And so, learning their histories and things, some the external factors that shape them are really interesting, but really trying to gain an understanding of them by talking to them is somewhat fruitless. That's what, Bob always says. And I tend to kind of agree with that. You really just never know.
I worked with that investigator in New York, or not worked with, but I covered things. And he was like on the midnight shift. So in New York, you really can't get near a crime scene unless it's like at 3 a.m. But you get to know the guys like in the different areas who work. And this guy said, if you want to know why somebody committed a crime, the person who committed it is the last person you should ask.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I see one of
one
of the comments down here. Yes. Sometimes they are embarrassed. They'll admit to something they did, but not another part of it, because it's almost, they know that it's too horrible to admit to, and they're not going to admit to it, even in whether it's embarrassment or they just know. I mean, that's even too bad for, a serial killer to do. So they're not going to admit it. And then also, again, these are their deepest, darkest fantasies. And another one of my colleagues used to say, imagine trying to, share your deepest, darkest fantasies with people. You're not going to do it. You're not going to be comfortable with that. Well, they're not either. And that always resonated with me. That was said to me pretty early on. It's kind of like, yeah, you're right. Even though, our fantasies are nothing compared to what the killers are, we're still uncomfortable with it. And they are too.
Yeah. And even if you have no remorse, and you have really, because I think of some of these cases where, I don't want to name any particular case, but I think of some of these cases where at times afterwards, and if you believe Richard Allen, he confessed 61 times to Delphi murder. He certainly, whatever was going on there, certainly doesn't seem comfortable with it. So just because you have the fantasy does not mean you feel like it's acceptable for everybody to know.
Right.
Oh yeah. I mean, when I haven't spent some time talking to inmates and stuff when I was in college doing forensic psych stuff, the one prevailing thing that stuck out with me of all the guys that came in, the completely independent of personality, every one of them used the passive voice when speaking about the crime. that they were involved with. It was just this distance, this language distance they were putting between. There was never I did this, or this thing was done by, or my charge, or so there's always this, and I don't even know that they're aware that they're doing it. I think it really is just this, I have to put this wall between myself and this.
I have an example from my own life. When I committed plagiarism and fabrication at the New York Times, for probably the first decade afterwards, I described it as when the scandal at the Times happened, as if like I wasn't a part of it. And I don't think I was necessarily not trying to take responsibility for it. At least I don't think. I think as I said those words, the situation was so painful and so embarrassing and so difficult that I couldn't put me in the sentence.
Makes sense.
I just thought to myself, I did an interview at some point years after that where somebody said, oh, I'm so glad that you said you did X, Y, or Z, that you fabricated and plagiarized. And I thought to myself at that moment, like, oh, am I finally taking personal responsibility for this fully? Am I finally at the point where I've come to some kind of peace about it? So I always notice that language now.
Yeah, I just, when it really was, whenever I was listening to that interview and I heard that, I was like, he has come a very long way. He must have, because if it was too close to it or whatever, I think
you mean
we all
mine?
do that. Yeah. Well, yeah. And I feel like that is, it's something I've done. I do as well. Absolutely. Anything I can think of shameful that I've done. I've found my brain kind of working that, how can I phrase this in a way that it doesn't.
I'll talk to you about the crime, but I have nothing to do with it.
Yeah. So that's a very
Jennifer,
human thing.
Sorry. So Jennifer has a question about whether it could have been a socioeconomic. I really like this question. Target. They had family paying for them to go to camp, and he has nothing. He slashed tents and threw the girls out of their safety. And that reminds me of something Larry Dry said. He said, I think he said it
embittered.
He said at the trial that the people in the town did not understand that Gene was not the man that he was before, that he came out resentful, bitter, and I forget what the phrase was, but it was that something toward the world, something negative toward the world. And, when Julia, you mentioned that the Girl Scouts themselves collectively could have been the victim, I also wonder whether like the community also could have been the collective victim.
Yeah. I mean, depending on how the community and how he felt with them there, as Jennifer points out, they have families being, that can afford to send them to these camps. I don't necessarily think that they were super wealthy just because they could send their girls to a camp. They're middle class but maybe doing better than some of the people in the town. So depending on how he viewed it, there could be resentment, which could be some of the reasons why he was taunting leading up to it. And resentful. It's possible. I don't know. I don't think that's the entire reason, but it could contribute to why this camp in particular was selected, as opposed to him finding a child somewhere else or other victims, like the women that he kidnapped years before. But yeah, there could be some motive there that we just don't know about, or some part of the selection process that we're not privy to.
Yeah.
Jessica has a quick correction for us, just a clarification that the supposed assault on the 2-year-old it wasn't an ex-girlfriend, but a friend of the family, and it was a 2-year-old boy who is a distant relative. So I'm not sure it changes the equation all that much, but let's just get that right for the record. So do you guys have any other questions that I missed? Feel free to re-ask them. I'm going to scroll through. Allison, did you see anything I missed?
I was scrolling through myself here. Just a second. Just want to make sure. So many good questions, by the way, from everybody. Oh, there was an interesting one, and we might have already covered this, but it was flagged before we started, for me to ask. The Lori Farmer, the youngest, of the girls, she was, negative for semen. And do you think that there's anything that we could tell after everything we've discussed, based on that, would be significant to you? If there was no semen found, I don't think there was evidence of sexual assault either. If I remember the research correctly.
Yeah, and I think it's possible that they weren't all sexually assaulted, but just because there's not any semen present doesn't mean she wasn't sexually victimized in some way, and there wasn't a sexual component to what happened to her. So I wouldn't
like a foreign
necessarily
object or
yeah, who knows? I mean, even just the entering of the tent is
right.
sexually motivated, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Lou Schlesinger, who is a criminologist who was somebody who taught us at BAU, and he's written lots of books on serial offenders, and he was really instrumental, or his work, some of his research that he'd done was very instrumental in kind of forming my ideas about sexual burglary. And I became kind of like this advocate of, if you have a burglar, you have a problem. And,
Right.
and I really do. I mean, I laugh about it, but it's just, I take it so seriously. When I teach about serial sexual assault and going back and looking at, the history of people, when you're looking for a rapist and you're not necessarily looking for sexual assault, you're looking for burglaries and, cases where things that don't make sense happened, and they might not be obviously sexual, but they have some sort of potentially symbolic meaning, and why they might not make sense to us, they make sense to the offender. And that's what you're looking for. So you don't always see evidence of sexual assault. There were so many cases involving Joe D'Angelo when he was known as the Visalia ransacker. I mean, he burglarized, over 100 homes, and many of them nobody would have recognized as being sexual in nature. But then when you go back and look at these cases as, not just as isolated, but as an escalation, you see it. Oh yeah, this was sexual. He did this, he did that. And you can see it then. So just because you don't see the sexual assault doesn't mean there wasn't some sort of offense committed against her in that manner, and that that wasn't the underlying motivation.
Okay, great. And then we also have on the screen here, Jess mentioned, do you think that Denise could have been marched out of the tent? Does that sound viable to you? I mean, she was the oldest, ostensibly would be maybe the biggest and the heaviest, perhaps hardest to carry, but also we, theorize that he might have been particularly focused on controlling her. Yeah.
I think it's possible because I don't think she was necessarily marched out of the tent without maybe some injury to her already. I think he probably had to do something to stun her and keep her quiet. But because she was, I mean, when you look at the focus and you look at, like, if let's say you're going back and seeing, okay, was she specifically targeted? Did she have any problems? You'd want to look at her because she was treated different. And it is possible that the other victims, Lori and Michele, were put in the sleeping bags to be carried out. And I do think there's possible evidence of additional sexual assault against Denise in the woods, right, as well. So, yeah, I do think possibly she could have been walked out or marched out. But, he's pretty, he's a football player. He's physically fit. I know she was a little bit older and bigger than the other two. I think it's also, he's perfectly capable and physically capable of carrying her as well.
Yeah.
So we've got one down here from Miss Ann. Is it possible that the offender was trying to lure a counselor into the woods by turning the light on and off? She ran, but someone else might have. He would have successfully gotten me, Missy Ann, because I would have walked right toward that light.
Not me.
No.
I know. Really would be like, bye, Jason.
No.
No, it just
You're on
reminded
your
me
own.
why I don't go camping. That's pretty much this whole case will keep me out of a campground for
My
a very long
curiosity
time.
will be the end of me.
Yeah, I do think that is possible. I mean, you know, Jason's theory about maybe just taunting her and scaring her, that's a possibility. But yeah, you know, drawing her out to him is kind of smart. Actually, it's lower risk. But what he also ran the risk of is she went back and told somebody, and they all come out and look for him, and so that would be pretty risky. But you know, there is the other witness who said that he grabbed her she was grabbed by a raincoat. So it is possible he was just trying to grab someone who was out and about, and when that didn't work out, he went into the tent to get his victims.
One of the things in thinking about that, this offender is either showing a lot of confidence, narcissistic confidence, or like psychosis. And I can't really
think he's
figure out which
confident.
one.
Yeah, I
Because-
think he's confident.
And what leans
And
me
determined.
against that. Yep. Yeah. Very determined.
He's
So-
determined. He was determined to do something, and maybe he tried, you know, as Missy Ann suggests, different ways. And but he's confident and I think he's comfortable and confident in that area. I think this is somebody who was very familiar with the area. You know, this is what I would say without knowing who was ultimately arrested anyway. I mean, you just don't go into the camp in the woods and, you know, lurk about in the dark like that for that length of time without being very comfortable in the area and knowing who's out there and what's out there and what to expect. I mean, anybody who's not familiar with being out in the woods and you're out there for the first time and it's strange, it's just not an area you're going to be comfortable with committing a crime like that. You have to be pretty comfortable in the area.
Yeah. And it's funny too. And I think Rosie makes a really good point in the chat about like sometimes people overthink, you know, aspects of crimes. And I was on with Julie Murray I had as a guest, and we were talking about, you know, the many strange things her sister Maura did on the day that she disappeared. And I was kind of thinking to myself, like, okay, I didn't go the most direct way to work today. I had to turn around and come back because I forgot to take a medicine that I had. I didn't park in my normal parking space at the office because I got there later. Like, how would people interpret those events as if I disappeared that day, or like that I didn't take a shower or whatever it was? That, you know, just because the offender did certain things, like it doesn't need to make sense always. It doesn't necessarily, and it very often, I think, isn't going to make sense. Jen has this question, or Jennifer has this question. How do you know if it's sexual or power motivated?
I think they're intertwined. I really think I think they're so intertwined. I mean, I don't, you know, while they're sexually motivated, there's so much control and power that's in violence. That's all part of it. It's all wrapped up together. And I don't think you can really distinguish, but I think that the sexual aspect of it comes from, you know, overpowering and being in control of another person, to, you know, and you know, the ultimate control is killing them. So I think I don't know that you can distinguish between the two of them. And I think they're just so closely aligned in terms when it comes to motive. Most of the time, I mean, I'm just, you know, every time I see these cases, and it's really hard to just lump them in because they are all very different. But I think the common theme that I see is control and power. And that's a common theme that you see, and that's what they're ultimately attempting to gain.
I remember taking a psychology class where the professor gave us these examples of different murders, like a serial murder, a drug-related murder, you know, fill in the blank. And he would ask us, what do you think the motive for the murder is? And no matter what anyone said, he said control. Yeah. Then every time, because he said, ultimately killing someone is about control. You're trying to control something. It doesn't matter what the situation was. And I thought that was interesting because while other things may be a part of the motive, really at the end of the day, killing someone is always going to be about having ultimate control over them.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very insightful question that I think that it's impossible. I mean, it's really just they're so closely aligned. But it's very
good to remind
insightful.
people of that, because I think a lot of people don't often think of it that way. A lot of people still kind of frame rape in the context of sex or sexual attraction, and it really is not.
Yeah.
Off, and
It's this isn't funny, but it's when I was back in the unit, and this is the first boss that I had when I was there, we got a case in, and it was a flasher. This guy was flashing people, and it was on a college campus, and they wanted, they were concerned, is this escalating? And, that was not the typical kind of case that we would work. And so it had come in, I think my boss was mentioning it, and he's like, that's just, I forget what he called it, but he just sort of said, that's not serious. And I said, well, wait a second. You have somebody who is forcing himself on people, and he sort of started to see it in a different way. They're imposing their will for you to see him naked, and that's a problem. And so it's like, even though, again, that is a power move. That is a way to gain control. I am forcing you to see something that you are not willing to see, or you are not consenting to. And so we dismiss those types of crimes. And, it was really interesting as he kind of came, he's like, you know what? You're absolutely right. You take it. You're going to do this case. And, so I did a whole profile and everything. And I picked apart every incident in which that this offender was doing this. And, I kept seeing these slight escalations. And ultimately he ended up grabbing a girl. And luckily again, this was on college campus and college students. And she wrestled with him and got away. And thank God she wasn't sexually assaulted, but they caught him. And I remember the chief, calling, the chief of the university calling, like, you're absolutely right about him. He was going to commit a sexual assault eventually. And so, we just talk about these crimes where it doesn't really seem like they're power motivated, but they really are. It's somebody else imposing their will on you. And I think in any kind of situation, whether it's somebody flashing you or somebody just imposing against your will, whether it's, just being forceful personality, you have to back up and proceed with caution.
Yep.
When anybody tries to control you.
Allison, are you ready for theories? Do you have your theory ready? I have my theory.
I do.
Which completely changed because of Julia. So. Which is sort of the goal. It didn't completely change, but
I'm feeling very validated. And some feelings that I've been having this last week and a half, 2 weeks here, as we've been sort of going through this. But I have been trying. I wanted to wait till we had this conversation. And first of all, Jayson, brilliant idea to have Julia on, because I feel like this was really needed to kind of bring the cohesion of a lot of these sort of disparate things that were swirling around in my head as we were talking about all this, from the crime itself, the evidence involved, the timeline, and then the whole social justice side of it, completely separate from that. So I've been sort of withholding having too many thoughts, firm thoughts on what happened or a theory, specifically because I just think, I think about what the jury went through, and a lot of the doubts that were sown there. And I had to put myself in their shoes a bit and try to see it from their eyes and everything. But after having this discussion today, I mean, yes, I do believe that my gut feeling all along and what we've discussed today kind of match up. That Gene fits the profile. And I had told Jayson this, that my gut is telling me it is him. And it wasn't just, I couldn't lay fingers on a specific piece of evidence that said, aha, this is the smoking gun, because there really isn't one quite. But when we look at the facts here, or the details, in my opinion, we have a very socially aware, articulate, intelligent, physically strong individual here. He has a history of violence against vulnerable people, young pregnant women, ostensibly, possibly kids, at least a desire possibly to attack children. Constantly minimizes his worst behaviors, which we'd established all of us do that, but it just was a pattern that stuck out to me.
Not me anymore, Allison. I paint my worst behaviors on billboards. So go ahead.
Same. I try to. I'm an author. I just put it in a book somewhere. But he just seems comfortable in an environment where, you know, he has to interact with presenting himself, like wearing the 3-piece suits and doing the press conference and kind of playing to the public and feeding into this folk hero image that was surrounding him. And then we have the taunting elements here. We have the note that the counselor received. We have the cave sign. To me, things like this, you know, when it says "bye bye fools," the killer was here, you are sending a message that you are thumbing your nose at the man in the biggest way possible, as well as that being the culture of the local community, which we discussed in the previous episode, right? But it points to a man who walks into occupied dwellings, who escapes prison. It points to a man who has been so embittered by society, or how he perceives that he has been treated by society, according to his friend Larry Dry. I would say a lot of this just kind of culminates in somebody who would be driven to commit an act of absolute defilement in order to horrify a society that he believes is his enemy, that has deprived him of his life and liberty. And what better way to do this than to brutally murder and rape 3 little girls and leave them piled up at the base of a tree, tossed away like yesterday's garbage. However, because after saying all that, there is a big however. You know, in a lot of cases, we hear people say, I think they did it, but I can see why they were found not guilty. And you hear that in O.J. Simpson, you hear that in Casey Anthony. There are many famous acquittals out there that people say this about. And I usually tend to think that's a sign that somebody wasn't paying as much attention to some of the details of the case. But in this case, it actually applies in my opinion. Because like I said in episode 2, you know, while the circumstantial evidence here of you know, the flashlight and there were the pictures at the cave, there were a lot of things, a lot of objects that, you know, look pretty solid from afar, but up close, it's a big old mess. It is the Monet effect. And, you know, it just, I can see how the defense could effectively poke holes in the prosecution's case. And then you add in the community aspect of this that has a history of harboring fugitives going all the way back to Pretty Boy Floyd. And these stories and these, you know, these close-knit people that all know the history of this town and the law enforcement. I can just see why he was acquitted. But do I think that he did it? Yeah. And that's probably without even factoring in the DNA problem. Always going to keep an open mind, but I do think ultimately they got their man.
Allison, I always say I firmly believe this with 100% of my heart until you provide me some other evidence that says I'm wrong. You know, always open to new evidence. I think for me, with you know, my thoughts really go back to things like that. That note that was found in the donut box, the weird things that were happening at the camp in advance, like the tents getting ripped. The fact that, you know, locals knew the Girl Scouts were coming that day, I really do buy into what Julia said, that at a minimum, it probably wasn't about these 3 girls, but the girls collectively or the community collectively. And certainly the behaviors before and the behaviors after, and the night before the murder, to me, you know, I sort of feel like it was a probably mix of attempting to taunt people, because I see a lot of unnecessary things behaviors that are happening that night that go beyond just trying to find a victim. But I think it was a mix of trying to find a victim or victims and taunting people. You see a lot of sadistic things from the note that was left to the note that was found in the cave. And, some of the sadism can continue far beyond that, the fear in the community and other things like that. And there were lots of events that happened, including trying to grab the girl with the raincoat, the counselor that kept on getting flashed with the light, other things along the low guttural sound. And you might write those things off to the imagination of the kids. But one thing that weighs on me is that a lot of those things were reported that night. They're reported to a counselor, they're reported to somebody else. And part of the reason why I know people make a lot out of the intra-racial aspect of crimes, I just get the feeling it didn't matter to the suspect, or it may have mattered to whoever the suspect was, but it wasn't the most important thing. So that's why it really clicked for me, Julia, when you said desirability comes first, then goes out the window. Because vulnerability on the other end, availability and vulnerability matter more. So when I think of somebody stalking the camp at night and that there is one Black girl in the entire camp, I have a hard time imagining, just based on everything we saw, that that was his target, that it was a more collective target. And then I think the other thing for me that really sort of stands out in that early, that early stage of things is, or at least of the case, I get why they would hone in on him immediately, right? You've got the detectives even said it in their interviews when Hart broke into the female police officer's house. He goes to the door. She says, "Stop and leave." He doesn't leave. He freezes. And it's not until she brings out her gun, clicks the hammer, that he leaves. And that idea that he was there for a burglary doesn't really wash with me. What makes way more sense, and the same thing with the assaults on the two older girls, that it really was about like power and control and getting off on the idea of violating somebody's boundaries. All these things involve violating people's boundaries to the extreme. So that weighed in. I think that weighed in for me too. Because I think a lot of things in Hart's background point in this direction. I felt like there's a lot of evidence that he had grievances against at least people in the community. Larry Dry, who escaped with him, I think the quote was, it was, Gene was not the person he used to be. People in the town remembered him to be. When he escaped, he was unbelievably bitter. And on many occasions, he planned to kill his son and wife. And he felt that the whole world had betrayed him and he was going to get him back. And this really seemed like almost like a terroristic, that he was trying to torture the whole community. And Dry is also the one who said he expressed interest in girls under 13. But based on what Julia is saying and everything I know, I don't put a lot of stock in the girl's age and other victims being different ages. And I think it also goes to the thing that I like to say, everybody has to start somewhere, right? Like, and I don't put much stock in the fact that he was charming. And in my mind, his charm afterwards kind of works against him. I think of people like Israel Keys, who had the investigators, they may have been faking it to some extent, but laughing along with him, or Ted Bundy, who charm people. And so I think when I think of the type of person who would commit the crime, and you really sold me on this idea, Julia, the brutality of the crime and the lack of remorse shown in the crime really sticks out to me. I don't think it was somebody who knew the girls or had some kind of strong emotional attachment to them, or even like a gentle attachment to them. I don't buy the idea that there was a second person for all those reasons that you were discussing before. There's no real evidence that a second person is involved. In terms of the tennis shoe, I don't know if you guys have ever really been in a lot of shock or been really surprised. If you ever go through a really shocking moment, go back and ask yourselves 10 minutes later, where was I? I don't even know where I was or what building I was in, much less what room I was in or what I could have stepped in. So I don't put much stock in the tennis shoe itself, but I really think that this is somebody who has a strong desire for revenge, somebody who's really brutal, resentful, callous, willing to take risks, fearless. And, I see elements of that throughout Gene Hart's history up and through the trial, even, his defiance. And I sort of think of like in clinical, I always look at things through a clinical lens, but there's this type of psychopathy where you see features of social personality disorder as a prominent feature, but you also see sadistic and narcissistic elements in it. It's called malevolent antisocial personality. And often those people are super charming, but underneath have a lot of resentment. They're willing to take risks. They are fearless. They're guiltless. And they're also very charming when they're monitoring their own behaviors. So I really don't put much stock in how he presented afterwards. Because at the end of the day, being a successful serial killer, being a successful sadist really requires an ability to manipulate. So I don't know why that would turn off simply because somebody's been charged. Because whatever's driving somebody enough to kill 3 little girls is so powerful that being put on trial for it is not necessarily going to stop that drive. One of the things for me that stuck out in both the crimes was I know Julia made the point that moving the bodies could have been cleaning up. But I kept on going back to the assaults on the 19-year-old girls. He sexually assaulted them in the car, then tied them up, put duct tape over their eyes, walked them through a field, across a creek, to a tree, and left them there for me, maybe in my mind, for no discernible reason. But it clicked in my head when you were talking about the idea of cleaning up and delaying the response. The one legitimate reason to do that would be to make it harder for the girls to make it back to the road and call for law enforcement, and easier for him to get further away. So I wonder whether this is a part of his MO for getting away with crimes. And that, he was caught for the previous sexual assault, and possibly either it escalated or he didn't want to be caught again. And he was caught because the victim survived and saw the license plate. And if the victims are all dead, that's not necessary. There are things like the ropes with both victims and cords with both victims, the flashlight that he was seen with. When we get to the trial, there are a couple things that happen that I think raise a lot of doubt. And one of them is 2 witnesses came on, I believe it's Joyce Payne and her son, Larry Short. And they testified that a Kansas rapist named Bill Stevens had come to their house that day with red paint with red stains on his shoes and scratches all over his body on the 13th. So the morning of the murders. Another witness who we didn't really talk about, a waitress, said that she saw that morning around 6 or 7 in the morning a man who looked a lot like Bill Stevens at her the diner where she worked, and that he was so disturbing and he kept on looking down on his feet that she called the police, even though she didn't know that the Girl Scout murders had happened. But we also found out that Joyce Payne was girlfriends with an inmate in Kansas who, the defense had promised, or he thought the defense had promised him help. So I have to sort of discount that testimony a little bit. But I think I do understand why there was doubt for the jury. I think I really, truly understand. Although I come to a slightly different position than you, I think with the available science at the time, right? Without the DNA advances, or we don't know that hair is reliable. To me, I think it's beyond a reasonable doubt with the evidence that they put on that Gene Leroy Hart was responsible for it. The things that stick out in my mind are his proximity to the area, his knowledge of the area, similar behaviors in terms of the ropes, the taunting, to the point you guys are making about the escape from all the boundary violations, whether it was escape from prison or the way those different assaults. I see those three sets of crimes as really similar. The 19-year-olds to me are very similar to breaking into the woman's apartment. To this, I feel like it was all sexually motivated, and it was motivated by crossing people's boundaries, taking power, and taking control over them. That's just where I'm at right now, or that's where I would have been right then. I probably would have been the one that got us to a mistrial with all the other 11 people going for acquittal. But I think over time, that news sort of tightened for me. And I have to tell you, I came into the case with the exact opposite position. I was like, there is a ton of
Yeah, because you've been fighting me all week.
Yeah. And that's why I don't tell you my theory before I get to my theory.
No.
You're mistaking my process for doubt. My process is to come up with an idea, then attack it and destroy it, and see what's remaining. So, and when I look at it, the evidence sort of points in that direction afterwards. In 1999, when they did the DNA testing, the 1 in 7,700 natives in America could have been the suspect. I calculated that out. And if you assume there were 1.4 million natives at the time, 49% of the native population was men, that would be 89 potential suspects. How many of them lived next door? Right? So that's got to be a relatively small group of people. It's a shame that the 19 DNA testing was inconclusive. My understanding is that they have, there is no DNA available to test anymore. So I don't know that we're ever going to get closure on this case. And I really do understand the jury's doubt, just given the evidence. But if they knew what they knew after the trial about some of the testimony, they knew what they knew about the DNA and know what we know now about behaviors, particularly that idea that our charming high school football player could not also be a mass murderer, I think they would have been much more likely to convict. But one of the things I tripped across when I was looking at it was Laura Farmer's mom, Sherry Farmer. And she had suspected possibly there were more people involved in the crime. But one of the things she said to the Oklahoman afterwards, she said, I've always felt in my gut that there was more than one person present. But given the DNA results, you have to wonder, she asked about, you have to wonder who took part, who could have possibly taken part in the murders. But the part that really stuck with me, she said, going back to the very first investigation, I felt they did a good job. And I never doubted the reasons for naming Hart as a suspect. We sat through every day of the trial, but it was not a perfect scenario to find him guilty. And we ended up with a not guilty verdict. And I really think I understand why the jury got there. I just think the jury got it wrong.
I mean, yeah, they did. And I also think bringing up a point that Jessica mentioned and that we shared in the last episode, I think there is absolutely a valid way for the jury to have, been uncertain. They acquit knowing that he's going back to prison for 300 years.
And I also think, to the points that you were making before, I think when you have a DA who gets kicked off the case because he's doing unethical things, and you have a poor law enforcement relationship with the community, the way I always talk to Brett from the prosecutors about this, I'm like, if you come into Baltimore versus you come into, I don't know, Northern Virginia where I live, the cops have like 70% 80% credibility walking the door. We believe everything they say over here in Northern Virginia. In Baltimore, it's like 25%. And you're like working your way up. Same thing with the LAPD. You have a larger hurdle for credibility. So I get that part of it. But I'm thinking about it just from the evidence in front of me, trying to objectively look at it. You know, I would have concerns for Hart or any native in that area getting a fair trial. I would want to look at tunnel vision. I'd want to ensure, just like the Cherokee Nation did, that he had money to fund his defense. But all that said, I also think that all the evidence seems to point toward him. And, you know, Stevens, I think that's a big factor. Stevens being white also. He's the prime suspect. He's white. His DNA excluded based on what they got. So I go.
And nothing points away from him. That was what I've been saying, like, for the last 2 weeks. I'm like, this guy cannot be excluded. I mean, he just can't. There's nothing to exclude this man.
So now I want to ask whether Julia thinks we're crazy.
No, I don't think you're crazy at all. I mean, there's some things that, in terms of what I would look at, that the jury wasn't able to consider.
Like the rapes and the detail.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's prejudicial. But in terms of behavior, and I'm going to stay in my lane and you know, stick to what we do in terms of behavior. Needs to be prioritized as the number one suspect until he can be ruled out. And as you just pointed out, Allison, he cannot be ruled out. I do think he did it. I think it was certainly, there were problems. I mean, it just goes back to, you know, crime scene and documentation and making sure you're, you know, it also goes back to what Jason said, relationships that the local law enforcement have with the community, and do they trust them or do they not trust them? And if you come in with that distrust, you're going to believe all these things that they could have done to set him up, to plant evidence, even when in some cases it would be completely implausible. You'd have to believe this to believe that. And
It's like OJ all over again.
Yeah. So it is very important, you know, for law enforcement always to do things right, do it by the book, have standard operating procedures.
Yeah, that's another thing that stuck out to me. Like, they really open themselves up by their procedures. Like you mentioned, that the way that they handled the tent. Well, like, another thing that stuck out to me was when they went to the caves to collect evidence, there was evidence that they didn't pick up because they didn't think it was particularly important. Several weeks later, they interview a Girl Scout and she's like, oh, this piping was stolen. And then they remember that the piping was in the cave. They go back to the cave, but 3 months later, I'm like, that's like asking me as the defense attorney to drive a truck in there about how you grabbed the piping and dropped it in there. So, you know, the question of whether I believe he did it versus what the jury should have done with the information they had at the time is, I think those are really two different questions.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So I got one more question, which is totally off topic, from Rosie. Rosie is asking, Jason, do you have any advice for people to get to that place in life about no longer being disconnected from something? And I'm guessing you were making that point about negative things. I think the most important thing for me, my advice that I would give people, is hang out with people who are willing to be vulnerable. And people who are willing to be vulnerable, whether they don't have to be vulnerable like me on the stage, they could just be vulnerable with you. I think being around vulnerability allows you to be more vulnerable. And once you're able to let yourself be vulnerable and sort of drop away those needs to be perfect and precise, you can bring your whole self to places. And it's unbelievably, I think it has this awesome effect of disarming other people. And you can probably see it in some of my interviews. It helps them talk about things they wouldn't normally talk about. So I hope I answered your question. I hope that was the right thing I interpreted. So anyway, guys.
The answer. That was a great answer.
Thank you.
Yes.
So we are going to go run now, but it's been a blast. We've got to go upload our recordings. Sorry for running so late, but Julia, this was so much fun.
It was
really-
so
Thank
much
you for
fun
having
and
me.
so
Yeah.
illuminating, and I hope it helped a lot of people that maybe were really unsure about this case. Maybe they have. Maybe we've changed a couple minds or opened a few minds. Let's hope.
Or maybe not.
Yeah.
But it's,
right.
you certainly opened ours wider, and I appreciate that very much.
And
Thank you for having me. It's an interesting case. I love doing this kind of work. It's my passion. So I was really happy to come on and talk with you both about it.
cool. And I'm going to throw in my plug for the Consult podcast, which you can find wherever you get podcasts. And also you should check out the Consult Patreon, where you can get early episodes. And I have a feeling some new things are coming for you soon. Vintage Villains podcast. And Allison also has a podcast called Ding Dong Darkness Time. And then, of course, me, Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We also have a Patreon and a Facebook group like the unsubs called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. We would love you all to be a part of our community and bring us your ideas and
there's a Vintage Villains group too. If you,
sorry, I forgot
so
about that.
there's a Vintage Villains soiree, and it's historical true crime. Anything prior to 1990. So feel free to suggest some cases there, like to get all back in history and provide a lot
Before
of historical content.
1990.
Well, I had to move it from 1980 because then I wouldn't be able to cover Pablo Escobar. And so I'm like, you know what? That's one of my favorite cases.
Time to retire. If 1990 is history, I'm gone.
We're not getting any younger, friends. I mean,
well, be good, everybody. We'll see.
All right. It was great to see you guys.
That was a lot of fun. I had hold on a sec. For some reason, it's not letting.
Oh, oops.
Uh-oh.
Oh, no.
Do we wait here? Does he come back?
Let's give him just a sec.
Yeah.
It's funny because
Is he still recording?
Did Jason just left and we were
I don't know.
Hey, Julia, let's start a podcast.
Made me leave. That was so much fun. I don't know what it was.
Are you still recording?
We're still recording.
Oh, good Lord. So I left. Let's go. Bye for real, guys.
And that's a wrap on the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders, my friends. I want to thank Jason and Julia for allowing me to be part of the exploration of this very sad and frustrating case. I'm curious as to whether your theories mesh with ours or diverge. Feel free to let me know. You can reach me over at vintagevillainspod@gmail.com, or you can swing by the Vintage Villains Soiree on Facebook and drop a discussion post. And of course, if you really love the show, I would absolutely appreciate your support on Patreon, which provides everyone additional benefits, including the ability to access those live recordings we do over there on YouTube. Jason and I will be teaming up again sometime in the near future, and Julia and I also have something up our sleeves for later this fall as we tackle the case of the Black Dahlia from 1947. Stay tuned for updates. I'll be back with another bad guy or gal very soon. In the meantime, you know what to do. Get out there and make good history, and I'll see you next time in another century.